As we know, prior to the Great Migration, the black population of the North was very small, with most cities having 1 to 5% black populations. Most black northern residents at the time were born in the region and were there for generations. This small population of black Americans became the northern elite, the ilk W.E.B. Du Bois and others came from. As the migration started, these northern elite were worried that the black migrants coming from the South would threaten their way of life. In his essay, Black Ghetto, 1890 to 1940, Patrick Renshaw states this, quote, "This old elite now found itself under challenge. Concerned above all else with securing their own position as a tiny, privileged black enclave within an overwhelmingly white society, the old settlers became increasingly fearful about the arrival of newcomers from the South. Their uneducated, unsophisticated country manners did not blend easily with those of the black elite, and they actually threatened the position in society which the latter had built up so carefully over so many years. After 1915, these fears appeared fully justified. We had been accepted as equals, one of the old settlers observed, but as soon as the Southern Negroes began coming in, we were relegated to their class." End quote. Now, this cultural clash is going to have its own video because I find it increasingly fascinating, but this is just to serve as a contextual placeholder for how the housing market operated during the decades of the Great Migration. Due to a large percentage of the Southern black migrants having low income, the housing market had to adjust significantly. This is compounded by the fact that even before the migration started, black Americans were segregated from white Americans, relegated to small communities within predominantly white neighborhoods. As more black migrants moved into these communities, white residents fled their homes in search for places that did not allow black Americans. As early as 1 year after the Great Migration in 1911, restrictive housing ordinances were enacted to keep white and black Americans separate. However, after the Buchanan v. Worley case in 1917, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that it was unconstitutional to restrict access to property solely based on race. While this was the law of the land, as we know, there were workarounds to this decision. What followed were called race covenants during the 1920s. These were private contracts that explicitly stated that deed owners could not sell or rent property to non-whites. Since these were private transactions, they didn't violate the Buchanan v. Worley ruling. During my research for this episode, I happened upon this article from nonprofit organization Shelter Force. It details how the residential security maps created by the Homeowners Loan Corporation were never created to redline cities. In fact, the term redlining didn't exist until the late 1960s. The HOLC's maps were created in 1935 to show the varying degrees of housing, environmental, social, and economic conditions in any area of a city. They were given colored grades A through D, A grade or green areas being the best, and D grade or red areas being the worst. While most people believe this map dictated redlining, the HOLC helped as many black Americans as they did white Americans during its existence. The author of the article found that more than 4 out of 5 people who lived in D-grade areas were white immigrants like Italians, Slavs, and Jews. In fact, over half of the white population lived in D-grade areas. However, black neighborhoods in D-grade areas were much worse than the white ones. The article goes on to say that, quote, "Not only did the maps clearly not influence the mortgage buying and restructuring activities of the HOLC, there is no evidence even after numerous scholarly investigations that they affected the lending activities of any other entity either. While the HOLC shared their maps with the FHA, all the available evidence indicates that the FHA did not use them. FHA made its own maps, which, with one exception, had since disappeared. Contrary to what writers have regularly asserted, there is no evidence that a single loan to any would-be homebuyer or anyone else was ever made or denied because of these maps." End quote. So who was to blame for the discriminatory housing policies? The Federal Housing Administration, or the FHA. It was created in 1934 by the FDR administration's National Housing Act to tackle the housing crisis going on in the country. This is coming off of the Great Depression's economy, where 50% of the nation's mortgages were in default by 1933. In a study by John Kimball titled "Ensuring Inequality: The Role of the FHA in the Urban Ghettoization of African Americans," he re-examines what took place at the time. The FHA became the authority of home lending and mandated what or who was eligible to receive funding to build, buy, or renovate homes. They also dictated who could live where, irrespective of private sentiment. Through this authority, the FHA conflated Black Americans with high risk. They created strict guidelines called the Underwriting Manual that explicitly excluded Black American communities from housing benefits. Kimball writes, quote, "For a mortgage to be approved for insurance, the FHA required banks to submit reports from the lender on the borrower's character and financial position, as well as from an architectural inspector, a risk examiner, and evaluator. The report of evaluator form focused on the location of the property under consideration and was required for every insurance application nationwide. The form asked the evaluator, are inharmonious racial or social groups present in the neighborhood? If not, is there any danger of infiltration of such groups? When? To answer these questions, a evaluator would refer to an area description form's record of percentages of Negro and foreign-born residents in the surveyor's assessment of the threat of infiltration of either group. This practice allowed FHA to steer the current of credit, vital for the health and growth of any community, exclusively into middle and upper-class white neighborhoods. It also ensured that integrated neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color would have virtually no access to mainstream sources of financial capital and the attendant benefits such resources would produce." End quote. Frankly speaking, Black Americans, especially the ones migrating from the South, were viewed and referred to as invaders into white communities. The FHA did everything in their power to restrict and contain Black American communities as a ways to, quote, protect white American communities from integration. Kimball highlights their recommendations by saying, quote, "The underwriting manual prescribed a set of methods to reduce the possibility of, quote, invasion by reducing the mobility of undesirable uses and racial groups." In a section innocuously titled Natural Physical Protection, the manual recommended a variety of ways that natural or artificial barriers could protect desirable neighborhoods from, quote, the infiltration of business and industrial uses, lower class occupancy, and inharmonious racial groups. If the area did not afford natural geographic protection, such as hills, ravines, and other peculiarities of topography, the FHA recommended that a high-speed traffic artery or a wide street parkway may prevent the expansion of, quote, undesirable entities into adjacent areas, end quote. Unsurprisingly, the FHA fervently supported the race covenants and deed restrictions. To them, it was just another method used to keep white neighborhoods white. Kimball writes, quote, "Unaware that in a decade the Supreme Court would cast these words in a new light, the underwriting manual pronounced, quote, it must be realized that deed restrictions, to be effective, must be enforced. In this respect, they are like zoning ordinances. If there is a probability of avoiding the deed restrictions through inadequate enforcement of their provisions, the restrictions themselves offer little or no protection." End quote. To summarize, if you were not a white person buying, building, or renovating in a predominantly white area, you weren't getting a loan for housing. While we can certainly place all of the blame on government entities for their role in stifling Black American expansion, there were other factors at play that made it easier for the government to do so. The 1944 report, Race Restrictive Housing, by economist Robert C. Weaver, breaks down how the mix between the large influx of Black migrants and increasingly segregated northern communities led to rapid housing deterioration and steep decline in property value. Weaver states, quote, "This mass influx of Negroes into many neighborhoods has caused and will cause physical deterioration. This, in itself, a byproduct of restrictions on the areas in which Negroes can live. As a result of these restrictions, there are extreme pressures for colored people to find shelter. When a new area is open to them, they rush in and the process described above takes place. Race-restrictive covenants, however, have not prevented and cannot prevent the expansion of the living space for mounting Negro populations." End quote. As more and more people poured into cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York, housing restrictions increased. Hopeful migrants were met with housing discrimination that was similar, if not worse, than the areas they left from. Each wave of migrants were poorer and less educated than the waves before them. Due to severely low housing inventory, migrants were cramping their entire families into one bedroom while sharing apartment units with other families. This was made worse by the fact that landlords were not incentivized to renovate their properties, leaving them in severe disrepair. Weaver expands on this cycle by saying, quote, "Forces constantly and steadily at work are causing a deterioration in existing neighborhoods. A neighborhood composed of new houses in the latest modern style, all owned by young married couples with children, is at its apex. The houses, being in the newest and most popular style, do not suffer from the competition of any superior house in the same price range, and they are marketable at approximately their reproduction cost under normal conditions. Both the buildings and the people are always getting older. Physical depreciation of structures and the aging of families constantly are lessening the vital powers of the neighborhood. This steady process of deterioration is hastened by obsolescence. A new and more modern type of structure relegates these structures to the second rank. The old residents do not fight so strenuously to keep out inharmonious forces. A lower income class succeeds the original occupants. Owner occupancy declines as the first owners sell out, move away, or lose their homes by foreclosure. There is often a sudden decline in value due to a sharp transition in the character of the neighborhood or to a period of depression in the real estate cycle." End quote. What we are seeing here is the proliferation of Black American ghettos. While the framework was laid back in the late 19th century, the manifestation of the urban ghetto was boosted by the behaviors of racist officials and a class of Black Americans that was largely culturally undesirable. These racist zoning laws and covenants forcing all Black Americans, despite their differences in behavior, led to many economic and social problems within the Black American community. While Weaver obviously criticized the racial covenants created up north, he knew that housing that matched the income level of the resident was more important. He elaborates by saying, quote, "Where adjacent areas are of a higher rent character, the process will be delayed and may be postponed for a period of time, depending in length upon developments elsewhere in the city. Here and there, a breakthrough will occur. It will be fought, but there is every reason to believe that, as the structures become older and less desirable, the restrictions will finally give way. When they do, the old pattern of occupancy with its attendant results will occur. If, however, there's an adequate supply of low-rent housing units adapted to the income and family composition of the masses of Negroes, fewer colored families will move into the high-rent areas where the size and high rental of existing structures necessitate overcrowding. During this time, shady real estate developers and dealers would employ a business technique called blockbusting. In the 1962 article, Confessions of a Blockbuster, a Chicago blockbuster using the fake name Norris Vichek broke down his operation as well as the business practices of his niche of real estate dealing. He spoke on how he and his fellow agents would prey on white homeowners by getting them to panic sell their homes at a steep discount. Vichek says, quote, "I specialize in locating blocks which I consider ripe for racial change. Then I bust them by buying properties from the white owners and selling them to Negroes, with the intent of breaking down the rest of the block for colored occupancy. Sometimes the groundwork, the initial block busting, has already been done by some other speculator by the time I arrive on the scene. In that case, all I have to do is work on the remaining whites and reap my share of the harvest." End quote. This process would net realtors immense profit. Vichek outlines his scheme by saying the following, quote, "I make my money, quite a lot of it, incidentally in three ways. One, by beating down the prices I pay to white owners by stimulating their fear of what is to come. Two, by selling to the eager Negroes at inflated prices. And three, by financing these purchases at what amounts to a very high rate of interest." End quote. Vichek gives a real-life example of how he busts blocks by saying, quote, "You may believe your home is worth $15,000, for example. If I bust your block, I will expect to buy it for $12,000 cash. The odds are that eventually you will sell for that price, if not to me, then to another speculator. Within a few days comes profit number two. I advertise and sell it to a Negro not for $15,000, but for $18,000. Financing the deal myself, I will accept $500 to $1,500 down with the remainder on contract. The easy payment plan, I believe it is called, that is, $150 to $200 a month until the contract is fulfilled. When is that? That is profit number three, the big one. The contract is fulfilled when I have been paid principal and interest totaling $36,000. These terms, I am told, force Negroes to overcrowd and overuse their buildings by renting out a part of them or to skimp on maintenance, starting the neighborhood on the way to blight. In most Negro neighborhoods in Chicago, the population density is 5 times that of white areas. The contract burden, I also am told, forces Negro mothers to work despite the presence of youngsters at home, compels the father to take 2 jobs, and can lead to numerous other problems because of the financial strain and anxiety. End quote. Here are some of the more egregious tactics some blockbusters would use. 1. Hiring black women to be seen pushing baby carriages in white neighborhoods to encourage white fear of devalued property. 2. Hiring black men to drive through white neighborhoods with their radios blasting. 3. Hiring black youth to stage street brawls in front of white homes to generate feelings of an unsafe atmosphere. 4. Selling a house to a black family in a middle-class white neighborhood to provoke white flight before the community's property values declined considerably. 5. Saturating the neighborhood area with flyers offering quick cash for houses. And 6. Developers buying houses and buildings, leaving them unoccupied to make the neighborhood appear abandoned, like a ghetto or a slum. White flight is traditionally cited as an economic detriment for black Americans, but as we can see, it hurt white Americans as well. Whether they were racist or not, white Americans generally wanted to live among other white Americans. Their fear and paranoia was used against them and forced them to sell their homes for less than what it was actually worth. Once black Americans moved in, banking institutions and planning and zoning committees prohibited the development of the areas. Believe it or not, the dilapidated project buildings that we grew up seeing or living in the 80s and 90s were actually considered good spaces to live in when they were originally built in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. They allowed for low-income residents, many of them migrants from the South, to have affordable housing. Since so many black Americans were pouring into these cities at a time, buildings with hundreds of units in them made the most sense. This, of course, would be short-lived due to the deterioration of the buildings in the communities overall. If you're wondering whether or not black migrants were good tenants, Weaver explains by saying, quote, "For 155 projects in 59 cities having 2 or more FPHA-aided projects, at least one of which is occupied by Negro tenants, the following results are reported. Collection losses do not exceed 1% of the total operating incomes for a total of 142 of these projects, 72 of which are occupied by Negroes and 70 by white or other tenants. 5 of the 13 projects showing rental losses in excess of 1% are tenanted by Negroes and 8 are tenanted by whites or others. The collection loss records between the 2 racial groups do not differ more than 1% in 51 of the 59 cities, and the records are identical in 34, end quote. Weaver concluded his report by offering a 4-pronged solution to the housing problems of black Americans, saying, quote, "First, plan now to make new housing available to Negroes. Second, be sure that this new housing is located and designed to meet the requirements of the market. Third, take steps now to open new non-segregated areas to Negro occupancy. Fourth, become informed about the limitations and ultimate social costs of race-restrictive covenants." End quote. As time pressed on, housing in the northern black communities would continue to face challenges. Redlining picked up where racial covenants left off. Redlining dictated where black Americans could live in any particular city or town. This also meant that these areas were subject to disinvestment, with many infrastructural needs being neglected. Couple this with swaths of low-income residents, and you see how this was a recipe for economic disaster. By the 1980s, the black American ghetto had reached its zenith. Most predominantly black neighborhoods were low-income slums, rife with crime, drugs, and an overall lower quality of living. When we combine all of these housing factors, we can conclude several things. 1. The number of migrants coming from the South overwhelmed northern and Midwestern cities. 2. Due to restrictive housing laws and covenants, it was impossible to properly accommodate these new migrants. 3. Institutional powers took advantage of the social and economic chaos that was taking place and made things worse. 4. The Great Migration exasperated the proliferation of the black American ghetto. And 5. So many black Americans were robbed of their home values. While there are plenty of Southern migrants who didn't experience these housing issues, so many more did, and they called for highlight.